Let's go ahead and we'll get started here. We'll get to the tyranny test as promised. Tonight, by way of just study and kind of reconnecting you, we're wrapping up our R.I.O.T series. This is week 4, right? Yes, right? This is week 4, right? Right, okay. If you have kids, though, they're going to be here next week, just so you guys remember. We do have rehearsal next week. Righteous Invasion of Truth, where we're talking about kind of pushing back against the culture and learning to speak into the culture with truth. And it is desperately, desperately needed. Now, I mentioned this verse to you. I want to look at it one more time again before we go jumping off and start looking at history and some stuff like that. Ran across it in my quiet time a couple weeks ago, shared it in staff meeting. It has been resonating with me. God has been using it for me a lot. I think there's a sermon outline in there, but we're not preaching it yet. But 2 Samuel 22:31 says this: "As for God, his way is perfect. The word of God has been proven, and he's a shield to all who find him." That has everything to do with what we're talking about. Because as we navigate this world, you have to understand what this passage is saying. It's saying that his way is perfect. Okay, so the God plan is the perfect plan. His word is proven. So when we talk about truth, we're talking about following him. What did Jesus say? I'm the way, I am the truth, I am the life. In that last phrase, he's a shield to all who find him. His presence is our protection. So in this verse, we get the reminder of the very thing that Jesus said to us, that he would be in our world. So his way is perfect, his word is proven, and his presence is our protection. And so in a culture that might want to cancel you, in a culture that it seems as like everything has gone upside down, if you're looking for a verse of the year, this might be it. If you're going to memorize one this year, I'm not telling you to do it, but I'm simply suggesting to you, this might be the one you want to jump to. It's a little bit longer than Jesus wept, but it's still, it says a lot. And a lot of times, because it's Old Testament, because it's in 2 Samuel, we don't, and we're obviously pulling out the context of a bigger story, sometimes we can blow past these verses and miss how big they really are, which is why I broke it up into three lines there and kind of show you kind of my outline of where and what I thought it would say. Because as you're trying to navigate a culture that would tend to tell you that what you value or what God is doing in our world, specifically America, is not that important, or he's not a part of it. You know better than that. I know you do. That's why you're here. I know that. But it is important to remember what we draw from. I mean, your goal every day, right, is to live his way, because his plan is going to be best. You want to live your life by his word, because you're going to try to build your life on truth, not your truth, not somebody else's truth, but God's truth, because he's our source of truth. But the good news is we're not alone when we do that he is there to protect us, and so his presence protects us in the place that we find ourselves. So remember that, keep that in mind as we kind of go back in history a little bit and talk about what it is that God has done and what we do in America and what that looks like and how that kind of ties in the things we're talking about. If you're on our, how many of you are on the Praying on the Mountain prayer list? Okay, I don't know if you read the thing I sent you earlier this week. But if you didn't, or you're not on it, I sent out this week as we were praying, the prayer for the week is, was really a prayer that kind of calls us back to remembering that God really is a part of who we are. He's a part of our history. And we live in a day and age where over and over again, I even heard it on a news feed this morning, that really God doesn't have a part of the public square. He doesn't need to be involved in the public square. That doesn't need to be included. And so in 1852 and 1853, I mean, history is rich because it kind of just repeats. There's cycles that happen, and you can almost predict some things that happen if you're a good student of history. And in 1852 and 1853, there was a movement in America to move God out of the public square. In other words, it was a move in America to push God out of the arena where We would not refer to God. There would be no monuments to God. There would be no religious connotation to any monuments that would be out there in the public square. And this is 1852. So, I mean, here we are, 2021, whatever it is. Can't remember what year we're in. It's COVID brain. But, I can't, we still are having the same conversations. And so it's not different. However, what is different is this. In the 1850s, the United States Congress decided to respond to these groups. And so from the House Judiciary Committee, this is the official statement that they released. You can find this if you want to go back and look for it. Go to the House of Representatives, 33rd Congress, Report on Committees. This is a quote directly from that document. It says this: had the people during the revolution had a suspicion of any attempt to war against Christianity, the revolution would have been strangled in its cradle. That's pretty strong. They go on to say, at the time of the adoption of the Constitution and the amendments, the universal sentiment was that Christianity should be encouraged, not as any one denomination. Because in this age there is no substitute for Christianity, that in its general principles is the great conservative element on which we must rely for the purity and permanence of free institutions. That is from the United States House Judiciary Committee. Wow. Nice. Good response. But they weren't done responding because this was such a big deal and they stepped down so hard against it and pushed back against it. The Senate Judiciary Committee, not the House, but now the Senate Judiciary Committee released this statement. We are Christian, not because the law demands it, not to gain exclusive benefits or to avoid legal disabilities, but from choice and education, and in a land thus universally Christian, what is to be expected, what is desired, is that we must pay due regard to our Christianity. In other words, what they're saying is you have to acknowledge God because without Him, there's no America. That's from the Senate. On the House side, they said if there's no Christianity in America, there's no basis for freedom, and they also said freedom will not last. But not to be outdone, the 1856 U.S. House of Representatives also declared this: the great, vital, and conservative element in our system is the belief of our people in the pure doctrines and divine truths of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, I have not heard anybody from the House of Representatives or the Senate make a statement like that in my lifetime. I would probably faint if somebody walked and raced to the microphone like they do on a regular basis and made those statements today. I mean, when they race to the microphone, what we get is the silly, shrill shysters that have something to say that has nothing to do with anything. They just like to get their airtime. But what we're reminded of, again, is that basic pushback against that blabbering misconception that somehow America is not founded on a Judeo-Christian belief system. It is. The reason that people don't know it is we don't teach history anymore. The reason that people miss it is they don't understand history. They don't understand where we've come from. And if you don't understand where we've come from, it's kind of hard to understand where we're going. And so for us as followers to have an understanding of that rich Christian heritage is important. For us to pray about that is certainly what we need to do. And in doing so, as I gave you guys door prizes last week on the Constitution, and those of you that are watching, that have watched this later on, that will watch this again, that ask for them, we'll get them to you. We just haven't sent them out yet. Promise. We'll get you your copies because I didn't want to miss out. And we want to make sure they get the copies as well. But as you know, I mean, that is just something that we need to be aware of. And so when we were wrapping up last week, I told you that there will be somebody out there, they always talk about this, that they will say to you that in the U.S. Constitution, God is not mentioned. Christianity is not mentioned. And that's true only if you don't recognize where it talks about dependence upon the divine inspiration, creator. But also the thing that happens is you have to make that statement, you have to separate it from the Declaration of Independence, and you cannot. And I kind of said as we were wrapping up last week, these are two documents that go hand in hand. The Declaration is written, and that establishes the fact that we have certain unalienable rights that come from our Creator. And that is where we declared our independence. It was later on that we came back and the Articles of Confederation were put into place. And the Articles of Confederation were what the national government decided would be the articles that each state could operate under. But that turned into a disaster, because when the states were left to their own without enough guidelines, what they began to do is revert back to the very same things and the patterns that they had rebelled against from Great Britain. And so it was then that these leaders and founders came back one more time to create the U.S. Constitution to build off of the Declaration of Independence. So there's not one without the other. America doesn't work if you separate them. But what you have to understand historically is that the Constitution comes about because in the Articles of Confederation, the states recognized and were responding to what was an unstable, unjust government structure for them to operate in, and they had to do better than that. And so they came back and they went back to work to come up with something different. And so when you think about history, you have to remember that what makes us Americans is not ethnicity or any subculture. It is our commitment to liberty and freedom. That's what makes everybody an American. It doesn't mean that you're a Christian or Jewish. It just means that's what makes us American. That's what ties us together. There is liberty and freedom. That's what we build on. Now, as a follower, you understand something that others might miss. That the reason we have liberty and freedom is because of that God-given right that we have as people to be free and to chase and explore and try this thing called the American experiment. There's no place in the world that exists to this day, no place in the world where there is a gathering of so many different types of people from such diverse backgrounds that are connected together in a cultural setting that rally around one idea of freedom. Now, you don't hear that when you watch the news. But there is no place else in the world where you can go and do the things that are making the headlines in the news today and still be allowed to do it. That's America. And America, like it or not, is tough sometimes. And we go through some tough times and we have to work some things out. But see, this dream, this experiment, if you will, is something that we rally around because freedom is that idea that draws us all together that everyone desires. And those who are wise and smart recognize that freedom is never free. And there's a cost to freedom. And if we're going to keep freedom and embrace freedom and live with freedom, then there is something that has to be done to ensure that. And so the founders fought for it. Because remember, I told you last week, they created these initial documents and stated publicly that they were pushing back against the tyranny of Great Britain, the rule of the king, the oppressiveness of this tyrant that they were going to just wanted to rob them of the freedom that they had to just live life and be who they thought they were supposed to be. And out of that just resistance to the tyrannical rule, they just pushed back against it and said something's got to change. And so that's what gets a bunch of people who form a ragtag militia that's willing at some point to fight against the strongest army in history at that time. The most powerful army on the face of the planet. A bunch of farmers decided they were going to take up arms and they're going to go to war. And General Washington made the comment on more than one occasion, if you go back and read some of his writings, we don't have the weapons to fight this war. We're not trained enough to fight this war. Our guys are freezing to death. And they're wanting to go home. And he kept telling them no. They stayed to fight. And if you go back and look a lot at what happened in the revolution, there are some moments in the revolution that if you really want to look at it through spiritual eyes, there's just no way those moments should have happened. There's no way that Washington could have snuck across the Delaware like he did. And it was a gutsy move, and it was a risky move, and it was a crazy move. And then that fog that rolled in, where the heck did that come from? But when it's said and done, you go back and you just have to decide, well, America is just the luckiest group of people on the face of the planet. Or there's something to this documentation that these guys put together. And they were willing to take a risk and be stubborn enough to push it. They were after freedom. And so they fought for it. And so they sought to summarize what was a natural God-given rights. And so they formalized it. And that was the reason for the Constitution. And so you're familiar with it. You've got a copy of it now. I know you read it all week long. There's no test coming or anything like that. But again, when the American dream is born in response to tyranny, the Constitution then is created, and this is important. The Constitution then is created as operating guidelines that are designed to be tyranny-proof. Now, it doesn't say that they're written to be tyranny-proof, but that's what they're written for. And you understand that when you take a look at the Declaration of Independence and you take a look at what's said in the Constitution, you recognize they're trying to figure out a way to create a document that will load up those certain unalienable rights that are given and endowed to people by God that the government cannot touch. That's what the Constitution is. And it's designed to give us the guidelines and the places that we need to go. And so, as I told you last week, so they had the opportunity to sit down and start and write down the most important things. And so they decided, after they wrote how everything was going to work, which is the first part of your Constitution, then they get down to what we call the Bill of Rights. And they put 10 of them together. Because again, they said, what would be, I mean, it's a simple question. What would be the top 10 things that we would say? What are the most important things that need to be included so that we can keep our government tyranny-proof? And so the First Amendment was the most important. And then they added the Second Amendment. And so you can see in this room as these guys are creating real time what it is that they're supposed to do, what it is that they see as the needs, what it is that they're trying to create that become the documentation that we're going to form and build a government around. And so you go to the First Amendment. You guys, if you have a Constitution, it's here. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people to peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And so in that, there are these things: religion, speech, press, the freedom to peacefully assemble, and the right to petition the government. And so the First Amendment guarantees freedoms concerning religion, expression, assembling, talking back to the government. It forbids Congress from promoting one religion over another, and also prevents someone from restricting, the government from restricting someone's religious practices. It guarantees a freedom of expression by prohibiting Congress from restricting the press or the rights of individuals to speak freely. It also guarantees to citizens the right to assemble peacefully and to petition the government. And then the Second Amendment comes along, and this is when it always is in the news, right? Amendment 2, a well-regulated militia. Being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And you know they wrote this because what's going on in the world at the time? They're pushing back against a tyrannical government, and they are fighting for their lives, and they wanted to have something that would ensure their freedom. And so they gave people the right to bear arms. In the 2008 case, District of Columbia versus Heller, the Supreme Court held that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to possess a firearm unconnected with service in the militia. So as the Supreme Court interpreted this, to use that arm for traditionally lawful purposes, such as self-defense within the home. You may not know, depending on what news sources you read, but the Supreme Court has agreed as of this week to put on their docket, it's not Supreme Court. Let me get this right. Yes, it is, yes. It is the Supreme Court that has said that they're going to take this case. It is someone now has made a petition from New York, because in New York you cannot carry. You cannot conceal a weapon. That case is now going to be heard, and they are willing to hear that case to see whether New York's gun laws about the ability to carry are unlawful or not and are in violation of the Second Amendment. That is a current court case that's pending right now. In a culture that's pushing back, and if you don't keep up with the news, there ought to be some times that you ought to keep up with the news, because there's another case that's rolling through the courts right now that also is being heard, because there is now a man who has petitioned for the right to marry his adult daughter. built upon the fact that same-sex marriage is now legal and lawful, which means it has changed marriage since we begin to understand it back in the Bible. So now, why can't consenting adults do that? If same-sex marriage is okay, the argument is, so is an incestuous marriage by consenting adults. That is now moving through the court system even today as we speak. Now, come back and go back now to things that you hear in the news about who's on the Supreme Court, why are they on the Supreme Court, and is it important? Now, and the truth is stranger than fiction. Let me give you a story that analyzes what's going on in the news right now. Sometimes a parody helps us see the truth in amazingly clear ways. So this is political. So if you don't want to hear politics, you do this for a minute and then we'll go back to the Constitution. La 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 la. This is a untrue news story to illustrate a point from Hampton Falls, Virginia. The official softball team of the Grace Cornerstone Life Baptist Church of Hampton Falls was losing fair and square against the Mormon team last weekend. But then they had a great idea. They wanted to rebalance the field by adding 4 of their own players to the outfield. The team was quickly accused of packing the field and changing the rules in the middle of the game, but they rejected these criticisms as unfounded and maybe racist. We're not packing the field, we're unpacking it, said Pastor John. We're simply rebalancing a game and making long overdue changes to ensure the fans have a voice. They would be really unhappy if we lose. He gestured to the stands when he said it, where over 7 fans were watching the game. The founding fathers of baseball never foresaw that one day we would be losing a game, especially against the Latter-day Saints. The rules of baseball are flexible. We consider them a living document. Therefore, we should be able to change the rules in the middle of the game to our advantage. If the rule change goes through, the church team will be allowed to immediately appoint 4 outfielders to join the game to help silence the Mormon bats. It may be a moot point, however, as Mormons have been accused of looking at seer stones to predict the opposing team's plays. Now, that's not true, by the way. But it's funny, isn't it? Until you realize that those driven with agendas who find ways and find abilities to pack courts get to hear cases like we've just talked about. And those cases are moving through the court system today. Today. And if you didn't know about them, and why would you be looking for stuff like that? The first time you hear about it is when it's a done deal. And you ask yourself the question, how could that happen? That's crazy. Yes, it is. But in the world that we live in, this is where we have the opportunity. Oh, okay. It's okay. Well, we have the opportunity to be able to push back and, when necessary, speak into a world that sometimes needs to know the truth. And so go back again to Amendment 1. Amendment 1 reminds us that the Constitution is not the Bible, but the Constitution does seem to be driven by divine inspiration. And so when you take a look at what's there, it limits the government's ability to take away or infringe upon practicing your own religion, speaking freely, reporting and hearing news, peacefully getting together and petitioning the government. Amendment 2 is the right to bear arms. And so here's the tyranny test. I told you we would talk about this, and we're going to have enough time to talk about it, and then we'll be done. But the tyranny test is simply this: is the government doing anything to limit or infringe upon those rights? That's the tyranny test. That's the question. Is the government doing anything to infringe upon those rights that are granted to you in the Constitution? And here's what you must understand. And again, everyone that hears me right now is going to hear this politically, and believe it or not, it is not. This is just a statement of fact. This has been the way it always has been. So hear me carefully. A tyrant will not directly attack any of those things that are on that list without churching it up a bit. Because a good tyrant builds their case. And it's always built under the guise of this phrase: for your own good. because there is someone who knows better than you do what you need. And a good tyrant knows that. You remember back when we did stuff, when we bookended this at the other end of November, and I told you how Nazi Germany moved in and took over and exterminated Jews, and really didn't even have to have a weapon to get them to climb on trains and go to death camps and die. Because Hitler was a good tyrant. And he churched up the reasons for doing it and convinced the people it was for their own good. So, if someone limits your right to assemble for your own good, it's because they know what's better for you. And why do they know what's better for you? Because here's the assumption: because you're not responsible enough to make that choice for yourself. Now, hear me very carefully. We're just coming out of a pandemic where the church could not meet physically for your own good. You didn't really have the chance to decide whether you needed to come or not. You didn't have the opportunity to know whether you could come or not. You couldn't make that responsible decision for yourself because there was a government mandate that said we cannot meet. I want you to know, I made a statement in a meeting when it first happened that that's really not constitutional. I thought I was going to get crucified. But I'm going to say it again. That was unconstitutional. But we did comply with Seminole County guidelines. They weren't state mandates, by the way. We complied with Seminole County guidelines, and we continue to do so to this day because we are also responsible and we want to help you along the way. But as you have already seen, people start pushing back on that. But you want to take the tyranny test. If you're not smart enough to make these decisions for yourself, a good tyrant will decide what is in your best interest and you will do it. And if you want to ask the question, who's the tyrant? You're not going to like this answer. It's the one who's telling you to do it. You found your tyrant. Welcome to the tyranny test. If you want to enter the gun debate, you don't need to have a gun because you're not able or smart enough or responsible enough to use it or keep it in your home. So we're going to limit it and limit your ability to have it because it's good for you and it's for your own safety. Because you can't be trusted with it. But that is a violation of the U.S. Constitution. If you're going to limit what someone can say, it's done because it's better. It ensures equality. It prevents you from hearing things you shouldn't hear. Because if you hear these things, it's not good for you. And so, we know better, so you don't need to hear that anymore. We don't allow that to be said. So we will cancel you. We will shut you down. We will not allow that to be heard. We'll take that voice out of the public arena. See, because it's good for us, they just can't let us, and I say us, do the things we would like to do because they care about us. Because somebody cares about you and knows better for you what you need. And so because of that, then we just need to do some things differently. Understand, and again, it doesn't mean that you don't have to make good decisions. And I'm not saying you don't have to make wise choices. And I'm not saying you don't have to have laws. You do. All is important. But let's go back to the Constitution. What are your freedoms? And why would you ever give those up? Because freedom dies a little bit each day at the altar of good intentions. It always has. It always will. How do I know? Venezuela, Cuba, China, and the Soviet Union. They all allowed it. So religion, yeah, see, somebody agreed. Religion, or an angel just got his wings. Religion Religion. Do you allow prayer in public schools? Do you put the Ten Commandments on a wall? Do you put a prayer on a wall in the Lincoln Memorial? Do you have to make a wedding cake for a couple that you don't want to make a wedding cake for? Do I have to do a wedding for a couple that I don't believe meets the biblical standards of what it means to be married? I mean, if it conflicts with my religious beliefs, should I have to do it? Should you have to provide abortion health care for your organization if your organization doesn't believe or doesn't hold to abortion as being religiously correct? We're doing it because it's fair and it's good for you, is the argument. Because somebody knows better than you do what is good for you. Take the tyranny test. You just found your tyrant. And you have to understand that all the things the founders could have chosen to put first, the first one they let off with was religion. Because here's why. For tyranny to rule, religion has to fall. Because it is the most difficult and it tends to last longer. It's harder to unravel. And a tyrant can't allow there to be any allegiance higher than themselves or the government or the ruling body. What did we say last week? For the first time in U.S. history, we are now living in a post-Christian world, post-Christian nation. Less than 50% of Americans now claim to believe in the doctrines of the Christian faith. Speech. Is there speech that's out there that is not permitted because the idea is unpopular? They're not talking about something that's profane or would incite someone to physical violence, but something when you start talking about ideas that other people don't like, or ideas that you disagree with or somebody disagrees with, are they muzzled, repressed because somebody might be offended? Hitler burned books. He silenced the educated that might challenge his views. And so to control or eliminate thought, anything that had historical references that didn't line up with what he was saying or what he wanted to be a part of the culture, he burned them. So the tyranny test. Is there an elimination of books? Are books being canceled in our culture today? Because somebody doesn't like the picture? Or like the way something is said? Because heaven knows, and I say this facetiously, you're not smart enough to know what to read on your own. You're not to be trusted to choose what your children read, because you can't make that call, because somebody knows better. And so you found your tyrant. Freedom of the press, less than 7% of the press in America today is conservative, which means that 93% tends to be liberal. But at the end of the day, ideological beliefs have in some ways have replaced a free press. So if press really isn't free, what you have to do now is you have to make a very purposed choice as to what and who to listen to. Which is why I say you've got to figure out how to balance things out. My challenge to you is to watch a couple of networks, if you're going to watch, and hear the difference in the newscast and figure out that the truth is probably somewhere in the middle of all that. Because from one side or another, you're not going to hear everything you need to hear. And the sources that I look for news at times, even though the information I just gave you comes from sources that were not mainstream at all, but just folks that are out there tracking and doing some things. We even have one major newspaper that decided that they're no longer going to have a fact checker because they don't need one anymore. Just to celebrate the new president's 100th day in office, they've now officially quit fact checking because they don't need to anymore.
Did he tell them that?
No, I'm just saying, that's just what they said. If you take a close look, What you've got to remember, peacefully assemble. That's interesting, and we talked about that a minute ago. You can petition the government, and you can still do this. You still have ways to petition the government. But here's what you have to remember. When government is big, people are small. And when the power structures are so big, people can't be heard anymore. Because if you take a look, if you look at the last election, America is 50-50 in beliefs politically. So, when one is minimized just because you can, you undercut the Constitution. It doesn't matter who's in charge. And so you have to ask yourself the question that we asked when we talked about this last November. When you're electing someone, are you electing someone that is going to represent you, or are you electing someone who is on the prowl for power and money? And what are they really going to do when they get in office? When you talk about the Second Amendment, again, people are going to fight about that, and they fight about it every time someone gets shot. But it's important to note that when the Second Amendment was written, the people that they were talking about had the same weapons as the government. Cannons, rifles, warships, individually owned by people, citizens. So when this rule was written, the balance of power was designed to say that the people who are your citizens need to have the same firepower as your military. Now, the Second Amendment is certainly not technically adaptive, because we wouldn't want your neighbor to have a nuclear warhead sitting in his garage. Even I could be a tyrant at that point. That's probably not good for you. And if you want one, it's not good for you. Because I know how I took care of my pool. I couldn't handle a nuclear warhead. I mean, I know how this works, right? But I still think at the same time, there is that moment when you have to understand that it was done to secure the rights of people and to limit government, not to give government more power where it comes in. See, I have people that come in my office all the time, and they're pro or con against guns. And I always take that as your personal choice. What my personal choice is and your personal choice is, I shouldn't dictate the opposite. If you're anti-gun, that's fantastic. Then don't have a gun. And if you're pro-gun, have a gun. And be responsible. And be licensed. If you carry it around with you, have a permit. You know, I've had people wanting to cancel me for the past month and a half. I know where the guns in the room are. I want to know. We've always worked with law enforcement. I've had people come from other states to worship services with the intent on hurting me. One of the darkest days of my life is when Ab and Stephanie moved to Georgia. I watched Ab Strickland on a Sunday morning follow somebody who had come for the distinct purpose of getting in my face. I watched him get up during the welcome as everyone was shaking hands. I watched him walk to the front of the room toward me, and I watched Ab chase him across the room to be with him. And what the guy didn't know is I also had a lead pipe that I was using as a sermon illustration in my hand as he was heading my way, because he had threatened me via email earlier in the week, and we nailed him as soon as he came in the room. Because he's crazy. Will people do bad things with guns? Yes. They will. Because people do bad things. That's evil. That's sin. That's the world that we live in. Deranged people will always do something bad with them. Evil people mess up everything. Right? But we, as a country, as people, have seen evil, and we've survived it. And we see evil, and the true test of any culture that's going to survive is figuring out, how do you handle evil? How do you deal with evil? See, the American experiment, when it begins with a Judeo-Christian background, recognizes that the way to combat evil is with the truth of God, and that God is the giver of the truth that gives you the rights that you do what you do. When you push God out of the marketplace and you push God out of the public square, when you push God out of the government, what do you use as your source to combat evil? It's sure not the people that race to the microphones on any given day and want to tell you what to think. That's why we as followers have to be so good at making sure that we overcome setbacks and disruptions, and we follow God with a passion that allows us to make an impact in the world around us. Because what can't endure is a tyrannical government. Because if you let them in, you can't get them out. To a T. Historically, that's where history matters. Every socialistic or communistic government was voted in. They always are. But you always have to fight your way out. And historically that is true. They are always voted in. And the people welcome them with open arms. We want you. And once they're there, the only way they leave is to fight. That is historically true in every culture where it happens, and it happens time and time again. Because again, what did we start with? When history begins, history has a tendency to repeat itself. I heard someone say this past week that America is too big to fail. Ben Franklin said this: those who give up a little essential liberty to pursue and purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. That scared you? That's air freshener. So at any given moment, as you hear things, use the tyranny test to ask the question: is what's happening going to attack an individual right? It could be an individual, it might be a group, it could be a party, it might be another nation, but that's your tyrant. That's how you find the tyrant. Anybody that doesn't want you to have the freedom that you have under the guise of, well, this is better for you. That's what we pushed back against when America started. I know that everybody heard it tonight, heard it under their own political lens. Everything I said was just put under that, wherever your political beliefs are, that's the filter that you just let all this flow through. People who will listen to it in the days ahead are going to decide what my political filter is, and they're probably going to be wrong. But I do know this: as a follower of Jesus Christ, I believe that what I just told you is right on the money historically. Because I did take history when I was a kid. And I love history. And I read history. And I learn from history. And I think that one of the things that we have to do is just be very wise as we navigate the world that we live in and recognize the gift that we have, which is why we gave you the gift of the Constitution. All right, we got to pray. We got to get out of here. Let's pray. Jesus, we love you. We thank you. And we just thank you for the freedom that you give us. Help us to always cherish it as a gift. Amen.